It was just after 1:30 in the morning on Route 46, a stretch of two-lane blacktop that cuts between sleeping towns, when I first noticed the headlights in my mirror. I remember the exit sign and the mile marker because I say them to myself now like anchors I wish I could have used to stop what followed. I was driving a company van, returning from an overnight drop, windows down because the air conditioner had died an hour earlier, and the night smelled like hot brakes and diesel. I was tired, the kind of tired that makes your eyelids heavy in a way coffee no longer fixes. And I told myself I would make the turn at the next well-lit rest area and wake up properly. What happened next changed how I think about every solitary ride after dark, and I am going to tell it all the way through because the details matter, from the clang of a hood slammed shut to the smell that stuck to my clothes for days. I had been doing night runs for 3 years, and the routine had calcified in the muscle memory. I knew when to shift, where to glance for mirrors, and how to judge other drivers by the weight of their brake lights. That night the radio played low, and the dashboard hummed like a small engine of confidence. I had 2 stops left, and my back was sore from a week of lifting heavy crates. There was a specific ache in my right shoulder if I moved the wrong way, and a line of sunscreen on my wrist from an earlier daylight run that turned out to be the only bright thing on me. The first time I thought the lights were just another truck was when I glanced down to check a text and then up to find a vehicle that was somehow closer than it had any right to be. The driver rode my rear like a shadow, matching my speed, before deciding to weave into my lane. Panic tightened my chest. I slowed, thinking to pull over, listen, ask if everything was okay. That moment seemed small then. It was not small at all. The first encounter was the one that made my teeth hurt when I remembered it. I pulled off at a gas station that had a single pump lit like an island and left the engine idling because I did not trust myself to get out of a locked position inside the van right away. There were 3 people at the pump, a woman in a muddy coat bent over the passenger seat of a pickup, and 2 men leaning over the hood like they were inspecting something, but the way they moved made it look rehearsed. Their voices were low but urgent. I told myself to stay calm and to play the helpful card because I had always been the kind of person who would stop for someone in trouble. The woman lifted her head and our eyes met for one breath, long enough to see white in them that did not look like fear or fatigue. It looked deliberate. "Hey, you all right?" I called, rolling my window down an inch because I was trying to be polite and not show my hands. "Yeah, just need a jump," the taller man said, voice flat like he had rehearsed the sentence in an empty parking lot. His name tag, absurdly, said Mike, though his clothes were not uniform and his hands smelled like oil. The other man, Sam, who had a beard and kept rubbing his gloves, looked at the ground and nodded. The woman, Rosa, kept her hands in her pockets and only answered in a whisper, "Please, we are stuck," as if the words could prove it. I hesitated, and the hesitation was the same split second that saved me from doing something I would later regret. I noticed a third vehicle parked beyond the trucks, a van with no plates, its headlights off, and its engine ticking the way a cooling motor does. The air tasted of stale cigarettes and antifreeze. I could feel the grit of road dust under my shoes when I stepped out to look like I was offering help. I kept my keys in my hand, and my phone clutched like an anchor. I walked over, making sure my steps sounded loud on the concrete. My heart thumped in my throat and my mouth was dry. I heard the dull clang of a metal hood being slapped into place, the smell of cold oil rising, the low rumble of voices continuing. "Do you want me to call a tow?" I said, because it was the neutral offer that got you out of the interaction if they wanted you gone. No, we can handle it," Mike said, quickly, too quickly. Rosa glanced at the unmarked van like she was deciding whether to trust me with a look. Sam cleared his throat and said, "You got any tools? Maybe a screwdriver?" His voice wavered like he was anchoring to something familiar. "Only what I carry," I said, and in my head counted the small toolkit under my seat and the tire inflator that the company had forgotten to replace last month. I felt the cool breath of the night and the pinprick of light from the convenience store sign reflecting off the chrome of a gas pump. I made the call to the idea that I would be kind and then keep my distance. That is when Mike put a hand on the hood above his head and looked at me almost with the pity of someone who has decided what you should do. "Look," he said, "we can get you coffee. You look like you could use one. Tell you about what happened." He smiled and revealed a chipped tooth the color of old enamel. I remember the way the fluorescent lamp above the pump hummed and made everything look thin and tired. I said no to the coffee and yes to the tow, which was the truth because the van still had a soft rattle under the dash when I kicked it. I called dispatch, and what followed was a series of actions that felt like both relief and a slow throttle to fear. The tow operator, Jenna, answered and said she could be there in 20 minutes. Her voice was an island of competence. She told me to stay near the building and to lock the doors. I agreed and walked back to my van. I kept watching the van with no plates parked in the shadow like a predator waiting. Sam and Rosa had gotten back in the pickup, and Mike pretended to check the battery cables. The entire scene had more meanings than the words exchanged. The first big escalation happened as I sat inside the van waiting for Jenna and watching through the tinted glass. The driver of the plateless van started the engine and pulled forward slowly like a cat testing water. I texted my dispatch, Mark, a single line that said, "Something not right at pump 3. He replied with a thumbs up and "keep me posted," which is what people say when they are either supportive or far away. The plateless van moved, lined up behind the pickup, and then flashed its lights in a precise pattern that made my skin prune. I saw the taillights of another vehicle sweep in like punctuation and felt my chest compress. I considered leaving then. I did not. A memory pulled up from my childhood of my father telling me to always help and that if you can, you must. That memory was warm, sticky, and suddenly irrelevant against the cold calculus of 3 people in one unmarked van. My hands were damp on the wheel. My mind ran a dozen possible outcomes and began discarding them one by one. In that long minute where you decide whether to get out or to drive away, I heard a voice outside my window, low and familiar in its cadence. "Hey man, you okay in there?" It was not Rosa. It was not any of the 3 at the pump. It was a voice that belonged to someone who had been around trucks longer than I had lived in the city. I recognized the cadence because I had shared a parking lot with the man for a year. The man was Marcus, a driver from another company who often started his routes at the same hour and whose rig I had once helped push when it stalled. He had a flashlight, and the beam landed on my windshield like a stage light. "Marcus?" I said, and the sound of my oxygen returning was literal. He came around the side of my van, and I could see grease along his jaw and a trucker cap with a logo frayed by long nights. He nodded as if to himself and then to the group. "You seen those guys?" he asked me. He did not wait for an answer. "Been circling for hours. Been seen at 3 different stations." His face was shaded and hard. "I flagged them off the highway earlier. They try to make it look like they are broken down, and then something else happens." At that moment, the plateless van revved and then drove straight at the pickup as if to box it in. Something in the exchange between the 3 people at the pump changed like a flip of a switch. Mike stood like a puppet that had been told to move. Sam's hands were in his pockets, and he touched something metal. Rosa was still in the passenger seat, her face hidden in the collar of her coat. Marcus did not hesitate. He stepped forward and put his hands up in a way that said both stop and stay where you are, a movement too old to be theatrical. "Get out of the van," Marcus said. "Now. Walk toward the lot light and keep your hands where I can see them." I listened, even though part of me wanted to argue, to stand up for the kindness I imagined I had. I unlocked the door with my left hand and stepped out. The night hit me like a cold metallic sheet. The sounds crowded, a flashlight buzzing, the hiss of a nearby radiator, the whine of a large engine that had shifted into predatory volume. And when Marcus addressed Sam, Mike, and Rosa, the conversation turned into a longer pulley of words. The exchanges were raw and direct, and they went back and forth for long enough that I could feel the seconds as heavy bricks being stacked. "Who are you with?" Marcus asked Sam. "We are just people," Mike said. "You broke down where?" Marcus asked again, his voice like a hammer. "Just 2 miles back," Sam said. "We have proof of the tow already set up," Mike said, trying to sound like someone with options. "Name on the truck?" Marcus asked, and the routine became detective and interrogative at the same time. Sam answered with the name of a company that Marcus did not recognize.
Marcus called someone, and within a minute, 2 other truckers had radios lit and voices crossing in a sudden chorus. A man named Pete, who had come out of the convenience store rubbing his hands together, said, "They tried this 2 nights back on the northbound. I saw them get into a white van without plates." Another voice, Lewis, from the overpass, shouted down that he'd seen the same van slow traffic at the bridge earlier that night. Each name added a thread. The more names, the less plausible the original story became. The men who had told me they needed a jump had less and less cover. The plateless van rolled back,
and the driver leaned out and shouted something that did not travel clearly over the din. The hour thickened. I felt adrenaline cut through me like a blade. I thought about calling the police and what I would tell them. How would you explain a setup that looked like misfortune and smelled like design? That is when I made a decision that I would later question in after-action reports. I went to my van and opened the back and took out the high-intensity LED work light I kept for late-night stops. I clicked it on, and the beam was like a small sun that made everyone squint. I walked it up over my head and began filming with my phone, because you learn fast that evidence is power and light is control. The men flinched. Mike cursed and stepped back as if the light burned him. Rosa hid her face further. Sam reached into his jacket, and I saw the glint of metal. Marcus moved like a man who has seen more than he tells, and shouted for people to form a line from my van to the pumps. Drivers responded, and the crowd took shape like a human barrier. We held that line until Jenna, the tow operator, arrived, and until the plateless van left with a tired, slow slide into the night. The police did not come, not then, and when they did the following day, it was to take statements that required me to tell the exact cadence of what I had seen and heard. The tow ticket, typed out by Jenna, listed our company name and the pickup's registration, and the unmarked van was noted as unknown. The procedural details that followed were precise and somehow comforting in their bureaucracy. The officer at the station, Officer Delgado, asked me to recount everything and wrote it down slowly in a notebook. The report he filed included times, descriptions, and witness statements. He explained the chain of custody and said they would check traffic cameras and canvass the nearby stations. He handed me a report number and told me to follow up if I thought of anything else. The description of how an incident gets turned into a formal record was efficient and concrete, and that helped even as doubt kept crawling at the edges. That first incident was almost its own little novel of tension and improvised community policing, and it left me raw. I did not sleep that night, and I filed a short report through the company just to make sure my back had a paper trail. But the next 2 horrors did not come to the pump. They came later, on different nights, and each pulled at parts of me I thought I had already insulated. The second one happened on I-9, just past the medical waste plant, at about 2 in the morning on a night not unlike the first. I was hauling a box truck full of furniture, my music set low, knowing that the interstate would be emptier than the arteries of most towns at that hour. The sky was a flat black with no stars, and the road smelt faintly of burnt rubber and wet tar. I had been warned by a dispatcher named Jenna 2 weeks before to avoid that exit if I could, that too many late-night drivers had stopped reporting people flagging them. I did not take her warning seriously. I thought warnings are for the timid and that experience is its own teacher. That arrogance is something I have had to live with since. About a mile before the exit, my headlights caught a figure in the median. He was standing with his hood up and his phone light waving like a bottle in a fog. I slowed before I reached him because the median was narrow and my truck felt like it could not just take a wrong step. He looked young, maybe in his 20s, and his hair stuck to his forehead with sweat. He looked frightened in a way that made me take pity, and a different memory moved through me of carrying my own nervousness to strangers when I was 18 and the world felt like a maze. I pulled over to the shoulder and cracked the window for ventilation and then for conversation. The young man, whose name I only learned later was Mateo, walked up to my door and said in a high-pitched voice that sounded like a radio on low, "My van died. My phone is dead. Please, can you help?" He was breathing fast. The sun glare from the highway sign painted his face with hard white.
I could smell a faint sweetness of perfume and the metallic tang of fear. I recognized that sweetness from an earlier job where a woman sat next to me and talked to fill a van with human sounds. I opened the door and told him to come to the passenger seat. The sound of his boots scraping the gravel was loud, and there was a rust smell to them. "Do you need a ride to the next exit?" I asked. My voice sounded more professional than I felt because I had learned to sound calm for customers. "Please, yeah, just to the light," Mateo said. He kept glancing at the road like someone looking for a problem and not seeing it. Inside the truck, the upholstery smelled faintly of old coffee and glue. He got in and introduced himself with more relief than a person should feel when getting a lift. The ride started normal. He told me he had been coming back from a cousin's house. I told him where I was heading, and the miles slipped away. Then he asked about my stop patterns, about the company, about whether drivers carried cash. It was small talk until it was not. His questions were too precise for a stranger on a midnight shoulder, and too aimed at my wallet. "Do you ever carry cash?" Mateo asked me, his hand tracing the rim of the cup holder. "Not much, only what is needed," I said, and felt the thinness of my honesty like a bruise. He laughed like a small animal and said, "That is smart. You never know." He looked like he had practiced the line. In the next minute, a white car on my tail flashed its lights at me twice and pulled up close enough for me to feel the gust of its air in the side mirror. The driver of that car, a woman with a quick jaw whose name turned out to be Jenna, though not the tow operator, leaned out and shouted something that got swallowed by the highway noise. Mateo's hands went in his pockets and he said, "They are friendly folks tonight." I hated the way he said it. I did not know then that two other cars were circling, one with tinted windows that reflected like a mirror, and another that slowed and left marks on the shoulder like a slow predator. When one of the cars pulled in front of me and braked abruptly, my training flicked on. I braked too and felt the trailer shift like a living thing. The white car blocked the truck like a gate. Two men got out of the car and walked toward my door. One of them, Luis, carried a baseball bat and smiled with a face too happy for the night. The other, Pete, had a camera dangling from his neck and said in a sing-song voice, "You mind if we film this? For safety, you know." The dialogue that followed between me and them formed a microcosm of choices and bad options. They asked for my papers, my insurance, my work manifest, like they were playing at authority. I offered my phone and a company badge, thinking authority would deflate them. It did not. The man with the bat banged it gently against his palm and said, "Think we should take a look at your pockets." He grinned, and the grin was a sharpened thing. Mateo sat very still, whispering something I could not make out. My throat closed. I remembered the first incident and how a line of other drivers had formed a human shield. I called out to the cars on the overpass and banged my flashers in a pattern that is barely a language. A man named Sam, who I later learned had been sitting in his rig eating, came down the embankment and yelled at the men to back off. Marcus, Pete, and a woman named Rosa appeared like protective godparents of the night. The two men decided to leave, and they left with a slow, deliberate swagger, as if they had taught someone a lesson. That second night left me shaken in a different way, because it had been almost theater. They wanted me to hand over control of control. The truck, and they had practiced the rhythm of authority. The police report the next day included a procedural paragraph about how to collect footage and witness statements, and I followed it when I went to the precinct. The way they described taking a report was clinical. They said they would issue a BOLO alert, which stands for Be on the Lookout, and that they would check nearby traffic cameras and license plate readers. The officer explained chain of custody for any footage I had captured and how to deliver a thumb drive so the evidence would not be corrupted. That explanation lasted 289 characters in my memory, and it felt both comforting and useless because evidence only matters if someone can follow up on it in time. The third horror was not on a side road or a patch of shoulder. It happened in a rest area parking lot under the bright, unforgiving lights of a 24-hour truck stop. It was 2 in the morning, and the lot had the mathematic placement of cabs and box trucks and a row of empty vending machines blinking occasionally. I had pulled over to nap and to file the incident from the first episode into a notebook. I thought I was careful now, but caution has holes if you treat it like armor rather than practice. While I slept, a man approached my cab and smoked with his back to the glass as if the cab were a campfire and he a man with stories. He knocked on the window and I woke with my heart rattling like a loose chain. He looked older than the others and introduced himself in a voice that had roads in it. "Name is Eli," he said with a slow drawl that should have made me trust him. He offered me a sandwich like an exchange between neighbors, and I must have had my guard down because his approach was gentle and he seemed harmless. Inside, the sandwich smelled like onions and something salty. I accepted half because the night had opened a hunger inside me, and a more dangerous hunger opened when Eli asked me about routes and schedules. He asked where I kept my extra cash, and the question was curious and exact. When I told him I did not carry much cash, he laughed and said, "Smart, but maybe you have something else." He tapped the corner of my logbook like he was identifying treasure. The man had a name tag stitched into a jacket that said Marcus, like the other Marcus, but it was different enough to be confusing. I remember thinking perhaps I am seeing patterns and tying faces together that belong separate. The dialogue with Eli slid from neighborly to intrusive quick enough that I had to make a choice. I could have told him to leave, called security, or opened the door and asked for his name again like a way to keep myself.
I opened the door and found a paper clipped to his pocket with the name of a nonprofit. He smiled and said, "We check on drivers, make sure no one sleeps with their door unlocked. I do runs. I check for people who look out of place." That was his pitch, and it was convincing. That is what worries you the most, the convincing lines. Then a shadow moved by the restrooms and a clatter came from behind the coffee machine. Two men moved and kissed the back of the building like they were testing if the lot had watchers. They looked casual, and then they did not. They walked with purpose toward my cab, and Eli's eyes shifted like he had switched channels. He said softly, "We are trying to help you keep your things safe." His tone suggested he wanted me to open my glove compartment. I did not. I locked the cab, and this time I did not wait for other drivers to form a line. I started the engine and rolled slowly out of the spot, keeping my headlights low. The two men followed at first, like they thought I would be an easy mark. They turned into the exit lane and then did not pursue. I waited by the light like a man with a fever, breathing in the smell of burnt coffee and the metallic echo of coin changers. Later, when I checked my cab, I found a small scratch on the door and a zipper of a bag slightly open, like a message. The message was that lines of civility are easy to cross. Each of these incidents had its own climax and its own way of leaving me raw. They also shared a set of names and faces that became a loose cast in the background of my nights. The secondary characters who showed up at different moments were Mike, Sam, Rosa, Marcus, Jenna, Pete, Luis, and Eli. Each one reacted in a particular way. Mike was pushy and rehearsed and seemed to be the instigator in the first episode. Sam moved like he wanted to be invisible and then showed flashes of defense. Rosa repeatedly looked scared and indecisive. Marcus appeared twice as an anchor, a driver who came to help and ended up being a turning point in the first incident. Jenna, the tow operator, and Jenna, the driver who blocked me on the interstate, are separate people who share a name and a sense of authority. Pete and Luis were the more aggressive pair on the interstate, and Eli was the one who blurred the line between helper and decoy. I watched each of them act and react in ways that told a larger story about how predator and prey trade places on the highway stage. There were specific moments of tension that stand out because they compressed my entire life into a decision. The first moment was when the plateless van moved to box the pickup. And I had to decide if I would stay in film or disappear into my vehicle. The memory of my father's voice warred with the cold logic that sometimes you must not be a hero. That moment lasted for a breath and felt like an hour, and I chose the light and documentation. The second moment was on the interstate when the white car braked and men in the night asked to search me. The fear there was a heat that hung in my mouth, and the memory of it makes my hands sweep my pockets like a prayer. The third moment was in the rest area, when the man named Eli smiled too readily and the two men behind the coffee machine moved with a purpose that made my stomach flip. Each of these peaks of tension had memory triggers and decisions that followed. The memory trigger for the first was a hum of fluorescent light that felt like an interrogation lamp. For the second, it was the sound of a bat being rolled in someone's palms. And for the third, it was the smell of onions laced in a sandwich, like someone offering hospitality to distract you. The backstory that threads through these three events is simple and important. I grew up in a small industrial town where the highway was less a road and more a vein that connected everyone to work and worry. My father drove trucks when I was a kid, and he taught me to light a map with a flashlight when you could not read highway signs. I learned to keep tools under the seat and to trust my wits more than any stranger's forehead declared good intention. When I was 21, I lost a brother in a late-night crash that left a scar across our family and taught us how brittle life is when you speed. That loss is part of why I drove at night and why I took shifts others would not. I thought I had hardened myself to solitude, but each of these incidents showed me how vulnerable routine can be. The job paid the bills and taught me that names on a manifest become anchors in your memory. It taught me how to notice a misaligned headlight, the wrong kind of smile, and the way hands fold when someone is about to ask you for something serious. Those lessons appear like breadcrumbing throughout the story of the 3 nights because I kept relying on the same instincts born from a childhood on the road and from grief that never fully settled. Between each incident I reported, I argued with supervisors and called police and tried to construct a coherent narrative that could be useful for investigations. The police brought back a folder the second week with a notation that read, "Repeat reports of similar behaviors had been filed across 3 counties." They told me about how they compiled BOLOs and how license plate readers and camera feeds were processed. The procedural description of evidence handling they gave me was straightforward. They said that footage needs to be copied to a secure drive, logged with date and timestamps, and then submitted with a written witness statement to maintain the integrity of any potential prosecution. They said they would cross-check toll cameras and traffic cams and send out alerts to nearby dispatch centers. It felt like a litany of hope. At about a third of the way into this retelling, I want to pause and reach out to you, because if you have felt that sudden prick of adrenaline listening to this, you are not alone. If you were in my seat that night, you would probably feel your chest tighten and that cold realization that the highway is a narrow theater for strange people. If you have been in a similar situation, write yes or no in the comments and tell me in one sentence what you did. Flee, confront, call police, or film. Your responses help others know they are not alone, and they help me decide what stories to bring next. I read them and I learn from them, and together we can build a set of practical responses for times when the road gets weird. Thank you for staying with me. Now, back to why the third night still feels like someone rewound the wrong scene. There are technical things you should know in case you ever must report something. When you file a police report, you will be asked for a sequence of details. Time down to the minute, exact location with mile markers, physical descriptions of vehicles and people, and any witnesses who can corroborate your story. If you have video, make sure to copy the original file to a USB drive and keep the original on your phone if possible. Officers will request a signed statement and might ask you to appear at the station to give testimony. Tow operators will fill out a release form if your vehicle is moved, and the mechanical assessment will note any external damages and fluid leaks. These things are mundane, but they form the backbone of any follow-up. The immediate aftermath of each episode was different, yet similar in the way it altered my routine. After the pump incident, I checked the van over and found a small dent in the bumper that matched a pattern of contact. I wiped my hands on my jeans and felt the grit of the night under my nails. After the interstate event, I felt violated and filed an internal company complaint about safety protocols and the route assignments.
My supervisor, Rosa in logistics, listened and said they would shift me away from the high-risk lanes for a while. I argued to keep my routes. I did not want to be sidelined. But the company is practical, and their priority is liability. After the rest area confrontation, I started carrying my toolkit within reach
and bought battery-powered locks for my cab door. I altered my route slightly and began to park in better-lit areas. I called my brother and asked him not to text me at odd hours because each incident made me cling to normality. Each reaction was a small adaptation that added armor but never solved the fragile sense that the highway is a place where the rules are thin. There are 3 concrete moments of tension I need to outline because they are central to why these nights mattered and why they became a series of horror snapshots. The first was the boxed pickup at the pump when the unmarked van moved in and the group dynamic shifted. In that moment, I felt a flash of responsibility wrestle with instinct, and I chose light and witnesses. The second lasted the 10-second standoff on the interstate when the white car braked and men demanded access to my vehicle, and I had to decide whether to hand over my keys. I remember the weight of someone's hand near a bat and the slow exhale of other drivers who decided to intervene. The third was the single, slow-moving approach in the rest area, which could have been as simple as a friendly check-in, and instead unfolded into a staged distraction aimed at opening a door. Each of these moments lasted like a thread being yanked through the machinery of my daily life and left us with choices whose consequences we still live with in small ways. 1 month later, I found myself driving the same highways with a new set of habits. I had spoken to an investigator named Officer Delgado who told me they had a potential lead on the plateless van, but that the case had been slow. The company adjusted my schedule and assigned Marcus as a backup contact, an arrangement that felt like being handed a veteran who knows how to recognize trouble before it arrives. I still carried my phone in my hand when I stopped, and I kept my work light near the dash. I had also started to keep a small notepad with the names of drivers and truckers who frequented particular pumps. I checked in with Jenna, the tow operator, and offered her coffee when she came by. My relationship with routes had shifted from complacent to alert. I told my dispatch that I would not be taking the late-night drop on Tuesdays for a while, and they respected it. The small changes made me feel slightly less exposed. 3 months later, I was called to give a detailed statement to a county detective who asked about patterns and timing. They shared that multiple reports had clustered around a series of truck stops and rest areas, and that a toll camera had captured a van driving erratically near the northbound exit at 2:30 a.m. The detective asked me to identify people in a lineup of footage, and I picked out the plateless van and a face that looked like 100 other men at night. The company had installed a few additional motion-activated lights at the stations I used and offered a modest stipend for a dash camera. I had one installed, and the sense of being watched became less invasive and more like a tool. I had begun to talk to other drivers about forming informal check-ins, and we would send each other quick messages when someone looked out of place. The small network mattered. 6 months on the road, things had shifted, but not entirely healed. There was an arrest in a neighboring county related to a string of stage breakdowns that matched our description, but the person arrested was not the one I had seen, and many charges did not stick. The patrols around some rest areas increased for a month and then decreased again with budget cycles. I changed trucks twice and moved into a daytime lane for a season so I could sleep properly. Marcus, who had become a friend, sent me a text the week he quit saying, "You got grit. Keep your light on." I met my brother for lunch and told him how the nights had hollowed me out and filled me with a carefulness that sat heavy in my bones. I still find myself checking mirrors more than before and still startle at flashes that are not mine. The scars are not only on the van or the dented bumper, they are on the way I cross a parking lot now with measured steps, and on the list of names I carry in my head. I do not have neat answers for how to prevent every scenario. What I do have are small practices that have helped me feel less fragile. Keep a work light and film when you can. Maintain a list of trusted fellow drivers. Park under motion-activated lights, and report everything even when it feels like overkill. If you are asked to hand over anything by someone whose story does not fit the evidence, do not comply.
Call authorities, call dispatch, and when possible, get other drivers involved. The police and tow operators explained chain of custody and data handling, and I followed those steps. If you can, submit footage on a secure drive and keep the log of times and witnesses. File a report. It might feel bureaucratic and slow, but it helps to have a paper trail. In the end, the highway taught me that kindness and caution must live together. The 3 nights left me with more questions than answers and an abiding sense that the road is a place where stories can change intent in a breath. I tightened my habits, I named a handful of people who helped, and I filed the reports that built a trace for others to follow if the pattern returned. If this resonated with you and you have ever been in
A similar situation, tell me in the comments one word about what you did and whether you would do it again. Flee, fight, film, or call. If you are new here and want more stories like this with practical takeaways, subscribe for weekly real drive accounts and safety tips. When the lights go out on the shoulder and the hum of tires is the only company you have, remember that light and witnesses are your best allies. On the road, silence is rarely just silence.